Live fast, die young is a cornerstone of the rock and roll lifestyle, but in reality, there's nothing glamorous about it. These rock icons met tragic ends, and the details are more disturbing than you think.
On the morning of February 3, 1959, early rock and roll icons Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, and J.P. Richardson, known as the Big Bopper, died in a plane crash while touring together through the Midwest. The event became known as the Day the Music Died and saw the first premature deaths of young and popular musicians in the early history of the genre. The crash also had a large impact on one of their contemporaries, according to Magic. Eddie Cochran was a part of the first wave of rock and roll stars, along with the three musicians who passed. His songs, Summertime Blues and 20 Flight Rock, became early classics in the genre and very popular among his teenage fan base. His appearance in films such as The Girl Can't Help It and Go Johnny Go helped his popularity grow. But according to John Collis's biography, Gene Vincent and Eddie Cochran, after the deaths of Holly, Valens, and Richardson, Cochran became obsessed with his own death, believing it was around the corner. While touring in the United Kingdom in 1960 with fellow musician Gene Vincent, Cochran's premonition came true. Following a performance on Saturday, April 16th, Vincent, Cochran, and others were involved in a single-car accident. Cochran died the next day, Easter Sunday, at the age of 21. He was the only one killed in the crash. Third time's the charm, they say. Released in 1971, the Allman Brothers Band's third album, At Fillmore East, launched them to superstardom after their first two albums failed commercially. The live album is hailed as a masterpiece today. Rolling Stone ranked it number 49 on their 500 greatest albums of all time. The band's strength and leader was their guitarist, Duane Allman. Allman had spent the mid to late 1960s as a must-have studio guitarist, working with artists such as Aretha Franklin, Wilson Pickett, and fellow guitar god Eric Clapton. Billy Gibbons of ZZ Top said this of Allman's guitar playing to Rolling Stone: Duane began doing things no one had ever done before. He was just a stunning and singular musician who was gone way too soon. On October 29, 1971, Allman was driving his motorcycle through Macon, Georgia, when he hit a stopped truck. His bike jumped in the air and landed on him, causing internal injuries. Though still conscious when he was taken to the hospital, the guitarist died hours later. The band continued without their leader, but tragedy struck again just a year later. On November 11, 1972, bassist Barry Oakley hit a bus while driving his own motorcycle and died from cerebral swelling. The accident took place a few blocks from Allman's fatal crash. Both men were 24 and are buried next to each other at Rose Hill Cemetery in Macon, WGXA reports. Mama Cass Elliott's weight has followed her throughout her life and death. As a part of the folk pop group The Mamas and the Papas, Elliott became a household name. However, John Phillips initially didn't want to put her in the band because of her weight, a fact that came to light in Elliott's biography, Dream a Little Dream of Me. After The Mamas and the Papas ended, Elliott still maintained a steady career in music and television. On July 29, 1974, she passed away from a heart attack in London, England at 32 years old. Even in death, Elliott's weight was still the story. A vicious, completely fabricated rumor spread that she died choking on a ham sandwich. Many publications, such as Time, ran with the now debunked ham sandwich story. According to The Guardian, Elliott's daughter, Owen, who was 7 at the time of her mother's death, angrily called the rumor, quote, "one last slap at the fat lady." At the time of her death, Cass was staying in a flat owned by singer Harry Nilsson that he loaned to her for her shows in England. The flat would become infamous for another death 4 years later. No rock musician lived life to the fullest more so than Keith Moon. His chaotic drumming made him a legend, placing him second on Rolling Stone's list of the 100 greatest drummers, and was the driving force behind one of the greatest bands of the era, The Who. Bandmate Roger Daltrey told GQ that Moon, quote, lived his entire life as a fantasy. Moon helped create many of the stereotypes that still exist today in rock and roll, like smashing hotel rooms and his own instrument, outrageous spending, and frequent alcohol and drug use that usually landed him in trouble.
So when people say, Keith, have you ever smashed up a hotel room? I said, yes, well, 3 in one fell swoop.
On January 4th, 1970, Moon and his entourage left a pub mobbed with skinheads that were harassing him. While trying to escape, Moon took the wheel of the car and accidentally ran over his friend, killing him. The judge cleared Moon of the 3 charges he pled guilty to: drunk driving, driving without a license, and driving without insurance, because of the circumstances at the pub. However, his friend Larry Smith recounted to VH1's Behind the Music that the moment had an effect on the drummer that he never fully recovered from. Smith said that Moon was shell-shocked. Moon's demise came 8 years later on September 7, 1978. He was pronounced dead at the age of 32 from an overdose of Hymenevrin. He died at the same age and in the same room where Mama Cass died 4 years prior. It is understandable to forget about a band's frontman when the lineup also features the likes of Eric Clapton, Jeff Beck, and Jimmy Page. That's what has happened to Keith Relf of the Yardbirds. When American blues music hit England in the late 1950s and early 1960s, bands like the Rolling Stones, who were named after a popular Muddy Waters song according to biography, and the Yardbirds formed with the desire to put their own touch on the music they loved. For Rolling Stone magazine's list of the 100 greatest artists, frontman Steven Tyler of Aerosmith described the difference between Relf and the more popular frontman for the Stones, Mick Jagger. He was a white boy who pushed it to the max, and he was a great harmonica player. You never heard Jagger hanging out on a single note the way Keith Relf could. After the Yardbirds fell apart in 1968, Relf continued his music career with various bands while his more well-known bandmates achieved greater commercial and critical success throughout the 1970s. According to Ultimate Classic Rock, on May 14, 1976, while playing an electric guitar in his basement, Relf accidentally electrocuted himself, ending his life. He was 33 years old. When Paul Butterfield was only a teenager, he was already being tutored and performing with blues legend Muddy Waters in Chicago. The Paul Butterfield Blues Band helped popularize blues music, a predominantly African-American genre, to a white audience. Living in Chicago, Butterfield was at the epicenter for the blues, as artists such as Waters, Willie Dixon, and Little Walter lived and performed on Chicago's South Side. The rhythm section for his band, Sam Lay and Jerome Arnold, were hired from blues legend Howlin' Wolf. Butterfield's aggressive blues harmonica playing led his bandmate and friend Michael Bloomfield to call him, quote, the finest blues harmonica player in the world at the Newport Folk Festival.
If he was green, it wouldn't make any difference. If he was a planaria, a tuna fish sandwich, Butterfield would be into the blues.
Amid the backdrop of the early and mid-1960s, Butterfield would defend his racially integrated band and often get into confrontations with racist concertgoers, according to guitarist Paul Fiden in the Horn from the Heart documentary. Butterfield was a living legend during his time. Author and journalist Grail Marcus said that during Woodstock, he saw other musicians from the band and Blood, Sweat, and Tears act, quote, deferential toward Butterfield. By the mid-1980s, Butterfield had reportedly developed a heroin addiction which had put a financial strain on him, and he'd been hurt by the recent loss of many of his close friends like Bloomfield, Waters, and his manager Albert Grossman. On May 4, 1987, Butterfield died of a drug overdose at the age of 44. From Oasis's Liam and Noel Gallagher, to the Kinks' Ray and Dave Davies, to the Jackson 5's Michael and Jermaine Jackson, sibling rivalries are not uncommon in music.
Yes, there's always rivalry, tension between people who are related, but that sometimes helps music.
However, few were as tumultuous and tragic as Creedence Clearwater Revival's feud between their two guitarists, John and Tom Fogerty. Despite being the younger sibling, John became the band's driving force, taking over all the singing and songwriting duties previously held by his brother. Tom did not enjoy losing control of his band to John, but John's control of the band drove it to superstardom in the late 1960s. After the 1970 album Pendulum, Tom left the band. 2 years later, CCR dissolved from more internal conflict between John and the two remaining members. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, court documents show that John became entangled in a series of contemptuous legal fights with the head of Fantasy Records, Saul Zaentz. In these fights, Tom was firmly in Zaentz's camp. John described Tom as having, quote, some sort of weird Patty Hearst syndrome. During the 1980s, Tom was sadly infected with HIV from a blood transfusion. Even with death coming around, the brothers stayed at odds. Tom died of tuberculosis on September 6, 1990, at the age of 48. Most people first heard Stevie Ray Vaughan's guitar on the hit David Bowie song Let's Dance. Bowie described his reaction to first hearing Vaughan in an interview with MTV in 1983.
This little kid from Austin, Texas, came out and just played some of the most devastating city rhythm and blues I've heard in years.
B.B. King described Vaughan's guitar playing to the Media America radio network as fluent and said, "He could get something going and it would go on and ideas continuously flowed." Vaughan was a music legend to other legends. Throughout the 1980s, he released 4 studio albums with his band Double Trouble. His guitar abilities placed him number 12 on Rolling Stone's list of the 100 greatest guitarists, and Vaughan is credited for helping to repopularize blues music during the decade. Unfortunately, during the early morning of August 27, 1990, his career came to an abrupt end. According to Guitar World, Double Trouble had played 2 shows with Eric Clapton, Buddy Guy, Robert Cray, and Stevie's older brother Jimmy Vaughan in East Troy, Wisconsin. Stevie Ray then boarded a helicopter to fly back to Chicago, but it crashed, killing all 4 passengers as well as the pilot. He was 35 years old. 1 month later, Vaughan's last album of original material, Family Style, was released as a duet album with his brother. Though mostly known in the United States for a single song, Kirsty MacColl was regarded as one of the finest artists of her generation in the United Kingdom. The BBC reported that U2 frontman Bono called MacColl, quote, "the Noel Coward of her generation." Johnny Marr of The Smiths said she had, quote, "the wit of Ray Davies and the harmonic invention of the Beach Boys." Her duet with The Pogues, Fairy Tale of New York, has become a modern-day holiday season classic. Jim Finer, songwriter and banjoist of The Pogues, told The Guardian that he questioned whether MacColl could handle her side of the duet, but lead singer Shane MacGowan had been a fan of her music and said she could make a song her own, and she made Fairy Tale her own. On December 18, 2000, the 41-year-old singer and her 2 sons were swimming in Cozumel, Mexico, when a speedboat illegally entered the area they were in. She moved one of her sons out of the way of the boat but was struck and killed instantly. Kirsty's mother, Jean MacColl, launched a one-woman crusade for justice, believing that the Mexican government hadn't been forthcoming throughout the investigation. The boat was owned by businessman Carlos Gonzalez Nova, who was on the boat. Deckhand Jose Sin Yam was found guilty of culpable homicide, although according to Kirsty's biography, written by her mother, Yam's wife and father-in-law both said he was not actually the driver. December 8th is a somber day in music history. The night of December 8, 1980, former Beatles guitarist and songwriter John Lennon was shot in the back by a crazed former fan, Mark David Chapman, while walking into his New York City apartment building. 24 years later, another legendary guitar player would be murdered on the same day. While performing with his new band, Damage Plan, Darrell Abbott, known as Dimebag Darrell, was shot during his band's set. He was 38. In 1981, Darrell helped form the heavy metal band Pantera, and his guitar riffs helped drive the band to success until they split in 2003. Pantera reshaped the metal genre over their 2-decade run. Pantera's drummer, Darrell's older brother, Vinnie Paul Abbott, said of the band in an interview with Rolling Stone in 1992, "We pulled the very best out of each one of ourselves, and with each record that we made, that mountain got taller and taller to climb." The gunman, Nathan Gale, also took the lives of 3 other people: club employee Aaron A. Hulk, fan Nathan Bray, and Damage Plan crew member Jeff Mayhem Thompson. Gale was killed by Columbus police officers minutes after the shooting. Rolling Stone reports that another fan saw Gale waiting in the parking lot prior to the show and asked him if he wanted to come inside to stay warm. He responded that he was, quote, "gonna wait for Damage Plan." In the documentary Once Were Brothers, Robbie Robertson and the Band, musician Taj Mahal said of the band, "If there were any American musicians that were comparable to what the Beatles were, it would have been them." The band featured, among others, drummer Lee Von Helm, bassist Rick Danko, and de facto lead vocalist and multi-instrumentalist Richard Manuel, known for having a very soulful voice and the ability to sing in falsetto. Despite his immense talent, though, Manuel struggled throughout his life with alcohol and drug addiction. In 1977, the group split up but reformed 6 years later without guitarist and lead songwriter Robbie Robertson. On the early morning of March 4, 1986, following a show in Winter Park, Florida, Manuel took his own life. He was 42 years old.
For many, the name Lynyrd Skynyrd instantly conjures up the day in 1977 when 3 band members died in a plane crash in the woods of Mississippi. For Lynyrd Skynyrd fans, that day was one of the most tragic in rock history. Here's the truth behind the Lynyrd Skynyrd plane crash. On October 20th, 1977, Lynyrd Skynyrd was skyrocketing to fame and had several new members on the start of a 3-month tour to promote their new album, Street Survivors. But they weren't exactly traveling in style. The plane chosen for their tour was an old 1948 Convair 240, a twin-engine prop that had already racked up over 29,000 flight hours. It was shaky enough that earlier in the year, Aerosmith had decided the plane was too dangerous to fly in. Still, despite the protests of guitarist Alan Collins and head of security Gene Odom, Lynyrd Skynyrd decided to use it anyway, with bandleader Ronnie Van Zant reportedly saying just before boarding, "If the Lord wants you to die on this plane, when it's your time, it's your time." It would prove tragically prophetic. The plane took off at 4:02 p.m. from Greenville, South Carolina, heading for Baton Rouge, Louisiana, with an estimated arrival time of 6:45 p.m. Pilot Walter McCreary notified the flight tower that they had roughly 5 hours of fuel on board, plenty for the flight. But just a couple hours later, while still over Mississippi, McCreary contacted the Air Traffic Control Center in Houston, saying they were out of fuel. It was the last communication from the plane. Band members were playing cards while Van Zant napped on the floor when the pilot suddenly alerted them that they were out of fuel. Drummer Artemis Pyle, a pilot himself, told everyone how to prepare for the crash. While some reportedly panicked, most just sat in silent prayer, hoping for a safe landing. 10 minutes later, the plane went down in the trees near Gillsburg, Mississippi. Keyboardist Billy Powell told the Orlando Sentinel, "I remember we started clipping those pine trees. It felt like being rolled down a hill in a garbage can and being hit by about 100 baseball bats at the same time." The plane then impacted the ground and skidded another 140 feet. The wings were torn off and the cockpit smashed into a tree, killing McCreary and his co-pilot William Gray. The fuselage broke off and the top of the plane tore open, throwing people out. Powell told Rolling Stone, "I crashed into a table. People were hit by flying objects all over the plane." The remains of the plane finally slid to a stop in a swampy, wooded area. Powell crawled out of the wreckage and saw that the fuselage, cockpit, wings, and tail section were gone. His nose, he discovered, was now hanging from the side of his face and bleeding profusely. The musician sat on top of the airplane in shock, crying, before he heard bassist Leon Wilkinson calling for help. "I remember Leon screaming, 'Get me out of here.'" Pyle also survived the crash, his ribs, quote, "sticking out of his chest." Along with roadie Ken Payton, the three left the crash site seeking help. They found it in the form of local farmer Johnny Mote, who originally thought the ragged men were escaped convicts, before realizing the awful truth. He told Rolling Stone, "One of them was hugging me around the neck and telling me, 'We gotta get them out.'" But there was no help for pilots McCreary and Gray, band members Ronnie Van Zant, Steve Gaines, and Cassie Gaines, or assistant road manager Dean Kilpatrick. All 6 were killed on impact, and the 20 survivors were in bad shape, with Rolling Stone reporting that they endured shattered bones, torn flesh, lengthy hospitalizations, and grueling rehabilitations. Fans were stunned as images of the crash began playing on news reports across the world.
You can't even realize, seeing one of these things on television, exactly what a crash of this magnitude looks like.
Speculation on the cause of the crash immediately centered on the lack of fuel.
Authorities still believe the plane ran out of gas. But why? Didn't they put enough gas in the tanks? Or was there a leak?
After a lengthy investigation, the U.S. National Transportation Safety Board released its official investigation. 9 separate findings were listed, including statements that both engines on the plane, quote, ceased to produce power because the aircraft's usable fuel was exhausted, and that the crew, Walter McCreary and William Gray, quote, failed to monitor adequately the fuel flow en route fuel consumption and fuel quantity gauges, and also didn't take appropriate pre-flight action to ensure an adequate fuel supply. But their mistakes were apparently compounded by a mechanical failure that caused one of the engines to burn through fuel much faster than normal. That would explain why, on another flight 2 days earlier, Alan Collins witnessed a 10-foot flame shooting out of the right engine. Ironically, Pyle told the Orlando Sentinel that during the tragic last flight, the band had decided that going forward, they would only fly on new planes. We had decided to get a Learjet for the band, a beautiful bus for the crew. It was ridiculous for us to be on an old plane like that. With the plane crash behind them, it would take time for everyone involved with Lynyrd Skynyrd to recover. 5 surviving band members, Alan Collins, Billy Powell, Gary Rosington, Leon Wilkerson, and Artemis Pyle, suffered critical injuries from multiple broken bones to debilitating internal injuries. It looked like the end of the band forever.
Will there be a Lynyrd Skynyrd after this?
I don't think so.
The first step in the recovery process was changing the album cover, which originally showed crash victim Steve Gaines surrounded by fire. But it was a long process, and it wasn't until a decade later, in 1987, that the surviving members of the band reunited.
First thing I want to do is bring out the survivors of our plane crash we had 10 years ago.
The band reformed, joined by a former guitarist for the group, Ed King, with Ronnie Van Zant's brother, Johnny Van Zant, taking over as lead singer. But there would still be more tragedies. Collins, who was left paraplegic after a motorcycle accident in 1986, succumbed to pneumonia in 1990. Wilkinson was found dead in his hotel room in 2001. And in 2009, Powell died of a heart attack. That left Rosington and Pyle as the only surviving members of the original band. In October 2019, Ronnie Van Zant's widow, Judy Van Zant Jenis, joined others to dedicate a new monument at the crash site, created with money from the Lynyrd Skynyrd Monument Project, which raised over $80,000. Van Zant Jenis said, "It's been 42 years today since we lost Ronnie, Steve, Cassie, and Dean. But they will live on through the music of Lynyrd Skynyrd and all of the fans from around the world."
Jimi Hendrix made himself into an icon thanks to a series of highly influential recordings and era-defining live performances. When he died suddenly at 27, the rock guitarist left behind one of the most enduring legacies in music. This is the story of Jimi Hendrix's tragic death. Given his unbelievable natural ability, it's tempting to think that Jimi Hendrix was born to be a rock superstar. But the reality was that during those brief few years in which Jimi Hendrix had taken the world by storm, the guitarist had worked himself to the bone. Hendrix's career began on the East Coast, where he played for a number of bands before finally being discovered by the British musician Chas Chandler, bassist of The Animals. Chandler saw Hendrix's enormous potential and took him off to England to form the Jimi Hendrix Experience. It was British audiences who first warmed to Hendrix when he couldn't catch a break in America, and his seemingly effortless cool both on stage and off masked a grueling schedule of touring and recording aimed at elevating Hendrix to the international rock music pantheon. But by 1970, Hendrix was almost completely used up.
If we're on stage, it's all in the world. That's your whole life.
That Jimi Hendrix had pushed himself too far was reflected by his poor health, but also in his complex financial situation and his numerous clashing social entanglements. All of these would come to a head in 1970, piling enormous strain on a musician at a moment of great physical and emotional weakness.
Yeah, well, sometimes it gets to be really easy to sing the blues.
According to ABC, Hendrix himself was well aware of the precariousness of his situation, telling a reporter in an interview at the time, "I'm not sure I will live to be 28 years old." According to The Independent, Hendrix told friends and journalists that he felt directionless and unable to trust any of the people around him. Hendrix's social circle was shifting and unstable, and the person he shared the last of his life with was reportedly a new acquaintance named Monika Dannemann. Dannemann's behavior around the time of Hendrix's death has been the cause of much speculation. Monika Dannemann was a German figure skater who became close to Jimi Hendrix, her musical idol, after meeting him following his 1969 concert in Dusseldorf. The two subsequently spent several days and nights together on Hendrix's European tour. But as noted by Rocks Off, many commentators have argued that Dannemann's account of her relationship with Hendrix is unreliable. Dannemann claimed that she and Hendrix were engaged, deeply in love, and have been in a committed relationship for 18 months at the time of his death. However, many in Hendrix's social circle have contested this, claiming that their relationship was far more casual, as evidenced by Hendrix's liaisons with numerous other women in the final months of his life. Whatever the exact nature of their relationship might have been, Hendrix did turn to Dannemann that fateful night. Details are sketchy, but the official story goes that Dannemann had come to London to reconnect with the legendary guitarist. She was staying at the Samarkand Hotel in Notting Hill while attempting to pin down Hendrix. Hendrix had been previously taking amphetamines, and finding he was unable to sleep at Dannemann's hotel suite, took 9 of her Vesparax sleeping pills, 18 times the recommended dose. As the circumstances of Hendrix's tragic death flooded the newspapers in the days and weeks following, Dennemann, as the last person to see the rock star alive, was given a huge amount of visibility and notoriety. The Independent had this to say about Dennemann being the last face Hendrix saw before he died. With some, that fact bestowed on Dennemann instant quasi-religious status. To others, she was forever the focus for suspicion surrounding the circumstances of Hendrix's death. Like her claims as to the nature of her relationship with Hendrix, Dannemann's testimony concerning what exactly happened the night of Hendrix's death was wildly inconsistent. In some stories, Dennemann claims to have left the hotel room early in the morning to buy cigarettes, and her account of what she found on her return changes. In ABC's recounting of Hendrix's death, the network had this to say about Dennemann's ever-changing story. Having found Hendrix unresponsive, either dead or near death, Dennemann claimed she rang an ambulance sometime between 9 a.m. and 11 a.m. Later, she insisted Hendrix was alive as he was loaded into the ambulance. Some have speculated that Dennemann may have purposely delayed calling for an ambulance to give her time to clear the hotel room of narcotics and cover up evidence of drug taking. According to The Independent, Hendrix's friend Eric Burden has claimed this was the case and that he helped to clean the apartment, but his story has also changed in the intervening years, making his recollection suspect. As fans around the world struggled to come to terms with the death of Jimi Hendrix, arguably the greatest hero of the 60s counterculture, wild stories concerning his death and who might have instigated it began to circulate. Quite possibly, these stories had their root in the unreliability of Dennemann's account of the events of Hendrix's death, as well as that of other members of Hendrix's inner circle who were supposedly in the know, such as Eric Burden. One of the most notorious theories was that Hendrix was in fact murdered by his manager Michael Jeffrey, from whom Hendrix was attempting to extricate himself at the time of his death. The story made headlines in 2009 thanks to a book written by former roadie James Tappy Wright, which claims that Jeffrey had confessed to the murder in private prior to his own death in a plane crash in 1973, per The Guardian. The Guardian also reported that Jeffrey told Wright, "We went round to his hotel room, got a handful of pills and stuffed them into his mouth, then poured a few bottles of red wine deep into his windpipe." Other suspects that have been posited by conspiracy-minded Hendrix fans include the Mafia, who had reportedly kidnapped Hendrix the previous year during a drug sale, according to a 2011 story in Rolling Stone. A 2008 story in Newshounds even suggests that the FBI may have played a role in the rock icon's death. Both allegations, however, are unsubstantiated.
Creepy dolls, shotguns, and enough booze to take a life. These are just some of the objects found at the death scenes of music's greatest icons. In 1991, Kurt Cobain, along with Dave Grohl and Krist Novoselic, made rock history and practically created the grunge movement with their revolutionary album Nevermind. But Cobain was already tired. In a Rolling Stone interview, he said, "All I need is a break and my stress will be over with." Cobain struggled with heroin abuse and suffered from deep depression, and his heroin addiction, tumultuous relationship with Courtney Love, and fame-induced stress sent him down a rabbit hole. Cobain tried to take his life in March 1994. Love checked herself into rehab, hoping to convince Cobain to join her, but in April, Cobain borrowed a gun from a friend and took his life at his home in Seattle. He was found 4 days later after his mother had filed a missing person report.
The lead singer of the enormously popular rock band Nirvana is dead. Apparently, he was a suicide at the age of 27.
2 decades after his death, police released images from Cobain's death scene to debunk murder conspiracies. At the scene were Cobain's borrowed shotgun, a cigar box containing drug paraphernalia, his famous sunglasses, a woolly trapper hat, and his suicide note, which he left in a plant pot with a pen stuck through the middle. Amy Winehouse won a staggering 5 Grammys in 2008 when she was only in her 20s. Her 2006 album Back to Black topped the charts worldwide too. Over time, though, the singer became as famous for her drug use and eating disorder as she did for her voice. Her brother, Alex Winehouse, later told The Guardian that he believes it was her bulimia, not her rampant drug use, that brought about her demise. He said, "You knew just by looking at her, she would have died eventually, the way she was going, but what really killed her was the bulimia." Amy Winehouse was severely affected by both her fame and the pressures of the music industry. The lack of anonymity that came with stardom worsened her drug abuse and bulimia. In June 2011, the BBC announced she had canceled her tour to solve several personal issues. On July 23rd, her bodyguard found her fully clothed, face down on the bed of her North London home. She had died of alcohol poisoning. Next to her body was a laptop on which she had been watching videos of herself performing. There were 2 empty vodka bottles on the floor. In 2009, Michael Jackson was preparing for a huge comeback via a series of farewell concerts at the O2 Arena in London. Jackson fans were so enthusiastic that 360,000 registered applications before ticket sales started, and the 10 concerts were up to 50.
I'm just never satisfied with what I do creatively, you know. I just regret the limitation of my own imagination.
Jackson was struggling with severe insomnia at the time, however. He had gone 60 days in a row without experiencing REM sleep. With this came a myriad of issues. He had paranoid episodes, he would talk to himself, and he was unable to remember lyrics or dance moves. That's when Jackson's doctor Conrad Murray chose to prescribe him propofol. Propofol is an anesthetic that should never be used as a sleep aid, however, as it doesn't induce REM sleep in the patient. On June 25, 2009, Jackson was found dead. The death scene included bottles of propofol and benzodiazepines, the combination of which triggered the fatal overdose. There was also an IV drip, Benequin tubes, an oxygen tank, a cardiology book, and for some reason, a vintage doll.
We have breaking news tonight out of Los Angeles, the death of singing star Whitney Houston at the age of 48.
While Whitney Houston was an internationally acclaimed singer, she also struggled with substance abuse and a rocky personal life. During the 1990s and 2000s, Houston was married to musician Bobby Brown, and their relationship became a frequent topic of discussion, with mentions of serious drug abuse and even violence. Brown later spoke on A&E's biography, Bobby Brown, and explained that both he and Houston had serious addiction problems. He claimed that he wasn't the bad boy painted by tabloids or the man who had gotten Houston hooked on drugs. Houston and Brown's marriage ended in 2007, but she continued to overindulge in narcotics. On February 11, 2012, she was found dead in a bathtub at the Beverly Hills Hilton. At the scene were a hairbrush, 2 hairbands, several prescription drugs, and olive oil, which was mixed in with the water. The official cause of death was drowning, facilitated by heart disease and cocaine use. Chris Cornell was one of the big faces of the grunge era as the leader of Soundgarden. In 2017, he and his band were on tour after a temporary hiatus. Soundgarden would give their very last show at the Fox Theater in Detroit, Michigan on May 17th. After the show, Cornell returned to his room at the MGM Grand Hotel, but about a half an hour before midnight, his wife noticed the lights in their Los Angeles home were flickering on and off. Cornell could activate them from an app in his phone, so she started worrying about his state of mind. When his wife called him, Cornell reportedly slurred his words. She didn't believe him when he said he'd only taken a couple of Ativan doses, so she called Cornell's bodyguard, Martin Kirsten, to go check on him. Just after midnight on May 18th, Kirsten entered the room and found Cornell dead. He had taken his own life. The police officers that arrived at the scene eventually found medication bottles containing prednisone, omeprazole, and lorazepam. The death scene photos also show Cornell's guitar case, sunglasses, a deodorant bottle, and a contact lens case. During his career, the king of rock and roll had 108 Billboard Hot 100 hits, 129 Billboard 200 charted albums, and a total of 67 weeks at #1 on the Billboard 200. In the last year of his life, however, Elvis Presley had retreated from the spotlight and become addicted to junk food, as well as a plethora of prescription and non-prescription drugs. On August 16, 1977, Presley's girlfriend Ginger Alden found him lying unconscious on the floor of their bathroom in the Memphis mansion Graceland. When the paramedics arrived at the location, they found an empty bottle of painkiller tablets and a vial of trisolerin, a tanning drug. When the paramedics took Presley to the hospital that day, they found much more in his system, several opiates, quaaludes, and codeine. He was pronounced dead at 3:30 p.m. His physician, Dr. George Nikopoulos, ultimately had his license suspended for prescribing Presley many of the substances that got him killed. Aaron Carter became a teen favorite in the early 2000s, with hits such as Aaron's Party, Come Get It, and That's How I Beat Shaq. In fact, Carter already had 3 best-selling albums by the time he was 13. But teenage stardom can come with a plethora of problems. In Carter's case, it was his parents who spent $500 million from his money, and the problems didn't end with his teens.
Do you feel like you're an addict?
Of course I'm an addict.
Yeah. Two.
I don't have to feel like it, I am.
Carter struggled with substance abuse, and in 2017, he confessed that he didn't believe he would live past the age of 30 when he was younger. He told Us Weekly, "I dealt with a lot of trauma, a lot of loss, a lot of loneliness. I just felt like I needed to get away. My goal is to be the phoenix that rises from the ashes." In 2022, Carter's situation started to look grim once more. He lost custody of his son and was fighting to get him back in September of that year. In November, his housekeeper found him unresponsive in his bath. He had drowned, aged 34. A TMZ report described the death scene. In the bathroom and bedroom were bottles of prescription medication and cans of compressed air in bottles, hinting at a substance-related drowning. Janis Joplin arguably epitomized the hippie era. She was also a fresh voice in a male-dominated genre and a very promising artist all around. However, Joplin also struggled with heroin addiction. On October 4, 1970, she was discovered dead in her Hollywood hotel room. She was found clutching money in one hand and a box of cigarettes in the other. 3 days later, her body was cremated and her ashes were scattered by her family into the Pacific Ocean. This was bad news for Joplin's friend, Peggy Caserta, who believes Joplin didn't really die of a heroin overdose, as she had used the same batch around the same time as her and claimed it wasn't particularly potent. The full reality of her death, as well as the meaning of the money and cigarettes, might remain a mystery forever. Not only was Chester Bennington the voice of Linkin Park, but he was also the heart and soul of the group. With him at the forefront, the band scored 6 #1 albums on the Billboard 200 and electrified fans around the globe with their unique musical blend of rock, hip-hop, electronica, and metal, as well as their angst-ridden and poignant lyrics. On July 20th, 2017, Bennington was found dead at his California residence. TMZ obtained a toxicology report that revealed further details about the singer's passing, as well as what was found at the death scene. According to the outlet, Bennington had taken his own life. In his pockets, investigators found coins and a boarding pass for a flight from Phoenix to Los Angeles. A handwritten journal containing what was purported to be Bennington's biography was found in the room, as well as a typed biography in the drawer of a nightstand. In addition, the officials discovered an iPhone, a half-empty bottle of Corona, 1 empty bottle of beer, a prescription for Zolpidem, and other miscellaneous items scattered around the bedroom.
On the evening of December 8, 1980, John Lennon and his wife, Yoko Ono, were returning home to the Dakota, their New York apartment, when a man called out to Lennon. Soon after, a few gunshots were heard, and Lennon fell down and was covered in blood. The shooter was later identified as 25-year-old Mark David Chapman, who stood by as his target bled out. Earlier that day, Chapman was outside Lennon's building with a copy of the album Double Fantasy, which he wanted Lennon to autograph. Chapman was a huge Beatles fan and was also deeply religious, but his opinion changed upon hearing his idol refer to his band, the Beatles, as being more popular than Jesus. Chapman later revealed that he had been planning to kill Lennon for a few months. He has since been incarcerated and admitted that he committed the crime for self-glory, saying, "He was very, very, very famous, and that's the only reason, and I was very, 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 very much seeking self-glory. Very selfish." Lennon was taken to the hospital several minutes after the shooting took place, and doctors attempted to resuscitate him for several minutes. However, he had lost too much blood due to the gunshot wounds he sustained and was pronounced dead soon after. He was just 40 years old. Just hours before the shooting, John Lennon was at a recording studio where he was working on a song with his wife, Yoko Ono. In the days leading up to his death, Lennon sat down for several interviews where he talked about his career with the Beatles, the music he was listening to, and the recent release of the album he did with Ono. One of the interviews was with radio personality Dave Sholin, and during their conversation, Lennon said that he hoped he had died before his wife. Just hours before his death, Lennon told Sholin, "If Yoko died, I wouldn't know how to survive. I couldn't carry on." The news of Lennon's death was soon reported by the media.
Lennon was shot and killed at about 11 o'clock last night.
A television producer named Alan Weiss was in the hospital after getting into a motorcycle accident, and it just so happened that it was the same hospital that Lennon was brought to after the shooting. In an interview with Newsday, Weiss said that he overheard police talking about Lennon, and afterward witnessed a doctor tell Ono that her husband had died. He then called the information to the news team. Soon, ABC News caught wind of Lennon's death, and Monday Night Football was interrupted to report the news. The days that followed consisted of fans mourning the death of a legend. About 100,000 people held a vigil at the spot where Lennon was shot, and 20,000 people gathered in his hometown of Liverpool. Mark David Chapman fired several shots that night, and 4 bullets hit John Lennon. Dr. David Halloran was on duty at the hospital and was the surgeon who gave Lennon a cardiac massage, hoping to get his heart beating. The heart itself wasn't hit by the bullets, but the vessels near the organ were damaged. Dr. Halloran told Inside Edition, "We weren't getting a pulse back, we weren't getting blood pressure back, we weren't getting pupil response back. He was very much gone." He was declared dead at 11:15 p.m. The medical examiner who conducted Lennon's autopsy reported that 2 bullets penetrated the shoulder and 2 bullets went into Lennon's back. He also said that Lennon died of shock and massive blood loss, and added that the death was almost immediate. One of the bullets that went into Lennon's back passed through the chest and his left lung before it exited the body. Another bullet also hit the left lung and was lodged in his neck. By the time Lennon arrived at the hospital, he had no pulse. Chapman was charged with second-degree murder and was sentenced to 20 years to life after entering a guilty plea.